Before I begin this week's episode, I'd just like to thank everybody who has listened to the first episode. If you like the podcast and you'd like to support it, it'd be super helpful to me if you could make sure to rate the podcast, leave comments, make a review if you feel up to it, and of course, subscribe to the podcast as well so that you don't miss any future episodes. So yeah, thanks again for taking the time to listen, and I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Palace of Mirrors, Season 1, Episode 2, A Prayer to the Palace. The year Kathy died, there were no stories for Darien. There was only winter and the unceasing snow flying on an endless wind. The year Kathy died, Darien discovered that nothing weighed more than silence. It was the year of his 19th birthday. It was the year of the longest winter of his life. Their store of food dwindled to rock-hard bread and flavorless roots, but winter took no pity on them. It waited, patient and cold, and Darien began to believe it would not stop until it had seen them all dead. Eventually, though, it broke. The winds stilled, and the sun rose beyond the clouds. It took another month for the snow to melt off. Darien's father opened the door, and fresh cold air rushed in to greet them. It tasted as sweet as any fruit. The rushing roar of snowmelt raging through the ravines had replaced the constant winter wind. Grass, fragile as the bones of birds, swayed in the breeze. Flowers, blue and purple, dotted the landscape with color. Darien lingered in their home as his sisters raced, heavy boots thudding, outside. They laughed, threw their arms to the sky, and spun in circles. Winter had ended late, but it had ended all the same. Darien could not laugh and run across the spring meadow. He could only stare into the turbulent sky. The clouds, red and orange and gray, cloaked the sky completely. Only a faint outline of the sun could be seen. Kathy had sworn that stars lay beyond those clouds, but on that spring morning, Darien could not believe she had been right. As a child, he had loved winter. It had been the season of stories and fires. Summer had been the season for work under a closed sky. Winter had been the season for sitting with Kathy. Summer had been the season of his father's sharp voice. Winter had settled into Darien's bones the day he was born, and it had never left. The plow tore the flowers up and turned their world inside out. In the distance, the constant thwack of his father's axe in the trees turned Darien's thoughts to the mother he'd never known. Her metronome sat unused on a high shelf in the house. Even Elizabeth, who played her fiddle almost every evening, never touched the metronome. Only their father brought it down, and then only to dust before placing back out of reach. Darien shook his head and tried to focus on his task. The electric tractor hummed under him. It was dented, but a fresh layer of paint protected the metal from corrosion. Every fall, before winter closed the world, they took great care to paint over even the smallest nicks. The tractor had been in the family for generations, but they all knew its days were numbered. Once there had been access to parts via neighboring farms, the occasional trader, or even a trip to the city. Few close neighbors remained, and traders no longer traveled down the beaten paths and ancient roads. And Darien's father couldn't spare anyone for the long trip to the city and its ever-changing politics. Darien's father hoarded parts and supplies that he had scavenged over the years, but eventually the tractor would die, and they would be forced to work the land by hand. Even now, Darien gripped a steering wheel that had worn down to a metal frame. Darien's gaze drifted to the razor-peaked mountains on the horizon. Those mountains dominated most of the moon, an unceasing sea of teeth. Only a small fraction of the world had been made to support human life. The moon had once been an important outpost known as Station 6, but no one called it that anymore. If they bothered to call their world anything, it was simply 6. Darien's head drifted as it always did to the clouds. He tried to imagine a time when that sky would have broken every minute of every day with starships bound for distant worlds. Once, when he was just a little boy, it had been easy to imagine. Now, when he tried, he saw nothing. Kathy would have laughed and told him to look harder, but Kathy was gone. In that moment, Darien didn't want to look to the sky. Tears blurred his vision, and he rubbed them furiously from his face. The axe no longer echoed over the field, which meant his father would be there to check on him soon. Darien didn't want to be found with tears on his face. His father didn't understand tears any more than he understood stories and stars. He was walking out of the trees now, his axe balanced on his shoulder. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, thick arms, and dark skin. His hair had been white for as long as Darien could remember. Deep lines ran along his face, like the ravines that ran across 6. He never smiled. At that moment, his brow was furrowed in consternation. With a jolt, Darien realized he had let the tractor drift to a stop at an awkward angle across the furrows. "What are you doing?" Darien stared back at his father, words failing him. "Well," he pointed at the tractor with his polished axe, "are you just going to run the battery dead, or are you going to turn that thing off?" Darien flicked a switch on the dashboard, and the air thinned as the hum of electricity faded. He shivered, and thought of those long, empty, cold months that had followed Kathy's death. Her voice had been a part of the fabric of winter. Without it, the home had been hollow. Her voice had been as important as the snow and the wind. "How long have you been wasting time here?" His father sighed. "I don't know what to do with you. I never have known what to do with you. All you seem to want to do is dream of things that are dead and gone and turned to dust. It's all her fault. I should never have let her fill your head with all that nonsense." Before Darien could begin to react, his father took a half step back. Blood rushed to Darien's cheeks, and he narrowed his eyes at his father. How could you say that?" He choked on the words, as though they had mass and texture. He leapt down from the tractor and stared into his father's eyes. "Take it back. You take it back." His father took another step back, but he didn't take the words back. He stared at Darien, as though his son were something beyond comprehension. Silence passed between them, hitting harder than fists. It pushed them to the ground and knocked the wind from them. At last, beaten, they looked away from one another. Darien stalked away. When he looked over his shoulder, he saw his father slumped against the tractor. If he hadn't known better, he would have sworn he saw his father's body shaking with sobs. But that couldn't be. His father didn't understand tears any more than he understood Darien. In the days of old, Kathy had told Darien, men and women prayed to the Palace of Mirrors. Darien had looked up at her with wide eyes and asked what it meant to pray. Her laughter had echoed between the walls like fluttering birds, and she had mussed up his hair. When she looked down at him, though, her face had grown serious. Prayer isn't something that can be described. True prayer, the kind that really means something, comes unbidden and unknown. Even your father prays, though he would never admit it. Darien had considered the words for a moment. But he would never pray to the Palace of Mirrors. He says it's nothing but nonsense. Kathy had smiled gently. True, but he believes in the spirits of those who came before us. Listen to him when the storm is howling the loudest, and you'll hear him talking to his father. Your father may believe more strongly than any of us, because for him no one is ever truly lost. They are in the land that they worked, in the air that they breathed, in the ones that they left behind. Darien had pursed his little lips. How do you know that? He never says anything about what he believes. He just glowers at me like I'm a rock in the middle of the field. Oh, my little space captain. She wrapped an arm around him. Your father loves you more than you know. Darien hadn't believed her, not really, but he had let her hug him close. After a minute listening to the beating of her heart, he had looked up at her. Auntie Cat, what do you pray? She smiled softly and looked to the ceiling, her face lit by the crackling fire in the stove. I pray that our food will last through to the next harvest. I pray that the summer sun will rise again beyond the clouds. I pray, she had laughed then and brushed the back of her hand on Darien's cheek. I pray that little space captains will go to bed and let their tired aunt get some sleep. Darien had obliged and crawled to his sleeping mat on the floor in the corner. He had burrowed beneath his thick blankets and closed his eyes. On the brink of sleep, though, he had blinked and seen Kathy on the edge of her chair with a mirror clutched in her hands. The golden frame had refracted the firelight, magnifying it in a way that filled the room. She stared down into the reflection, her lips moving silently. No matter how hard Darien tried, he had been unable to make out her words. He had only seen the pain deep in her eyes and the tears that glistened on her cheeks. Darien sat in that same chair now. It had always been Kathy's chair, as long as he could remember. He held Kathy's mirror, turning it over and over in his hands. The artisan had etched dragons into the gold frame of the mirror. Their serpentine bodies twisted between trees all along the edge of the frame. At the top they met, their heads so close they could have been kissing, and at the bottom of the mirror their tails twisted together in a complicated knot. Darien stared down into the mirror. He tried to find the prayer that would answer the hole in his life where Kathy had been, but no words, silent or otherwise, came to his lips. He only saw his own face, his own dark eyes and skin, his own scraggly hair, his own pain. He only wanted to see Kathy once more, to hear her voice, to know that she would be there when he woke. He drifted to sleep there in her chair. In his dreams, he felt eyes on him. It caused his skin to prickle. He spun, and then he found them in the dark shadows between dreams. Purple eyes, bright and piercing. They took his breath away, and he started awake with a great gasp. What he saw when he woke sent a jolt of fear through him. He had to run. He had to hide. He had to fight. He had to do something, because the world had gone wrong while he slept. He did not wake in Kathy's chair. He did not wake to the heat of the wood stove. He did not wake to his sister humming to herself while she got ready for the day. He woke standing before a great window, a window as long as their home. Outside, a sphere of green and blue, impossibly beautiful, hung against a backdrop of black. Clouds drifted and spun, like living things, over the surface of the world. World. It was a world, Darien realized. A planet. It was beautiful and perfect and... No. Something was wrong. It wasn't perfect. Scraps of blackened metal, twisted and broken, floated in an unruly mass in the space around the planet. They drifted, like leaves on the surface of a pond. Only when Darien saw the smooth silver lines of a great ship did he understand that the metal must be the wreckage of ruined starships. The great ship had been cast from a metal so pure it almost looked like glass. It had been crafted in the image of a horse frozen in gallop, its mane swept back. It held itself tall and proud, still as morning and silent as dusk. Around it, other ships, dull and squat and dead in comparison, flew at one another. Beams of energy cut the darkness of space. Looking out at that ship, Darien realized with a start where he stood, who he must be. Dark Sheldon, standing on the bridge of Nightingale. The great ship before him could only be Greywind, once the flagship of the Imperial Guard. Soon Dark would fire the shot that would destroy that magnificent ship. It would burn through the sky and turn the beautiful planet below to ash. Darien wanted to move, to do something, to say something. He had to stop them. He had to stop this from happening. He could not move. A sadness deeper than night in winter settled into Darien's bones. He knew the feeling well. It was the sorrow he'd felt since before he could remember, the sorrow of never knowing his mother. It was the sorrow he felt when he looked into his father's gray eyes, tired and worn as the earth he worked. It was the sorrow he felt when Kathy died and the world kept turning as though nothing had changed at all. He woke, truly woke, with a ragged gasp of air. His hands ached as though he had been working without gloves on a cold morning. He looked down and saw a lattice of frost across the surface of the mirror, despite the still warm stove nearby. He tried to set the mirror down, but it had frozen to his skin, and he had to pull it loose. The cold metal left a red mark on his skin, dragons etched across his flesh. Darien's father charged across the room, and Darien realized what had woken him. Heavy knocking, desperate and panicked, thudded against the door. Fear spidered inside Darien's veins. The nearest neighboring farm lay miles away on the other side of the ravines. They rarely had visitors. His father grabbed a long rifle from beside the door and gestured for Darien to hide in his room. Darien crept inside but left the door open a crack. His father, with a fluidity that Darien hadn't realized he possessed, opened the front door and swung the rifle around to face whoever stood there. A shadow shook in the darkness before crumpling onto the floor. Darien recognized Tom Billings, the farmer from the neighboring farm. Blood matted the man's thin black hair. Darien rushed out of the room to his father's side and knelt down by the man. They had met only a handful of times, but Tom had always been kind to Darien. The man had liked to sing silly nonsense songs that caught in Darien's head for weeks. His eyelids flickered open. "Are they here? You need to be ready. Be ready. They could be here. They could be here." Darien frowned and glanced up at his father, who looked just as confused. "Slow down." His father knelt down and probed the wound on Tom's head. "Who could be here? Who did this to you?" Oh, Palace, they took her. They took my daughter, my son." Darien's father froze. "Took your children? Who would do such a thing?" No. They only took Cass. They killed him. They killed him when he tried to stop them. One of them wasn't even human. He... Hey, just breathe. Just take a minute. Darien took the man's hand. Sally crept out of her room with a medical kit and began to clean the wound. Elizabeth stood in the door to their room, her eyes wide. "A man with the eye of a demon," Tom writhed. "A woman with two swords. She laughed when Billy tried to save his sister. She laughed and cut his throat." Tom went silent, his body shaking as though it would never be warm again. Darien thought of Kathy's mirror, how cold it had been when he woke. He wondered if there was any prayer that could help Tom. Even knowing the answer was no, Darien found himself praying. It came to him, unbidden and unknown. Next week on Palace of Mirrors. Haunted by the past, Darien and Tom set off on a journey across Styx. They must pass through stunted forests where great cats roam, and past dark ravines that cut deep into the surface of the moon. The path before them both is clear to read, but will it take them where they expect, or to someplace else altogether?